Thank you for joining me on my pivot table tutorial. In this video, we are going to replicate the pivot table report you can see on screen at the moment. This is a fairly typical sales performance report. It's got actuals, budgets, the difference between the two, and the achievement rate. The analysis itself is for salesperson and region. We are comparing 2 years, 2009 against 2010. We do have a month filter at the top, which we can use to restrict the data by a given month or a combination of months. We've got totals of the rows to the right, and at the bottom here we've got the totals for the columns. Since we are replicating this report, we'll need to grab the source data of it. So if I go into the data area, highlight the whole lot, do a Ctrl+C on my keyboard to copy it, create a new workbook, do a Ctrl+V to paste that data in. What I tend to do is to label my sheets so I can see at a glance what they contain. In this case, I know this is data, so I'll go ahead and call this one data. I would like my pivot table to be on sheet 2, so I will name this one, double click on that and name it pivot. I'll then move it to the left so it becomes the first worksheet. Then I go back to the data. As we can see here, this is basically a simple database, and the key thing about it is that there isn't any gaps between the columns or the rows. The data range itself is actually from A1 through to G458. To begin creating a pivot table, if I go back up here, we can place a cursor anywhere within that data range from A1 to G4568. But I'll place my cursor on A2, which you can see at the top there. So that's A2. I go into Insert, click once on the pivot table icon. We can see here that Excel has determined the correct data range for us. I could have used an external data source such as a Microsoft Access database or a text file, or indeed any other ODBC or database. Below here we've got where we need to put place the pivot table. We can either put it in a new worksheet or an existing one. Because I've prepared the other one earlier, I would be choosing the existing worksheet. I'll use this button to find it. Click on the pivot. Click on A1, that's where I would like my pivot table report to start. Press enter and then OK. Now we've got a shell for the pivot table. This left hand side here is where the pivot table will appear. To the right we've got the pivot table field list. This area is effectively a window into the source data, so these items we can see here are the column names. If I go back in here, are these column names of our data source. Below that are some boxes that help us place the items where we want them. So for region, as we saw on that report, the region was a row label, so we would drag that region to the row labels. And as we do that, we can see there that the report is beginning to take shape to the left. In pivot table, there's usually more than one way of doing exactly the same thing. Some instances you've got at least 3 ways. You've seen me drag and drop, which is the method I prefer. However, I could also place a tick against the salesperson, and the default behavior in Excel is to place that as a row label. So I can demonstrate that now. If I click on that, we can see this gone into the salesperson is gone as a row label, and it's appeared on the pivot table there as well. We had year as the column label, so I would drag the year to the column labels area, and we can see it up there. For the month, that was a filter. I placed that in there. And for actuals, we need the values. We also need the values for the budget. Currently, Excel is telling me that's count of actual. It's summing it up as a count, which is really not what we want. It's got it right for the budget as a summation, but this one is giving me a count. So we can change all that. If I click once, or use this little arrow, but I prefer to click once on there, I can see value field settings. If I go in there, I need to use sum and then give it a custom name. With custom names, you can't give a name like actual because that is a name that exists already. We can see there's actual there, we've got budget, etc. We can't give it any of these names, it would actually complain. If I try that now, okay, we can see there that it tells you that name already exists. So what I tend to do is put an S against it, but of course it can be any name we want. Once we've got a custom name for it, we can go for the number format. I use a custom format because these numbers are in millions, or quite a large number. I tend to round them up in thousands. So in this case here, I would have, bear with me 1 second. And the negatives would be in bracket. And then just put semicolon there. Pardon me, should be a semicolon if I can find it. Okay. Right. So that now gives me that 65. There is actually 65 million. As I mentioned previously, more than one way of doing exactly the same thing. So for the budget, if I place my cursor on the budget and right click on it, I can also access the value field settings from here. If I go in there, we've got a sum already. In this case, I want to actually give it a custom name of budgets and then a number format, which would be similar to what we had for actuals. So I would choose what is in there already. Then OK. The next stage is to do the calculations for the difference between actual and budget. Of course, we could easily, if I go back to the data, we could easily have added the difference here. But in some cases, we may not have control or access to the source data, especially with the database. So it's useful to be able to do calculations based on the field list items. We could do those calculations on the pivot table report itself. To do that, we go into the pivot table tools, and to the right we've got a number of options here, and one of them is formulas. While we're here, we've also got change data source. So if we were to add a new column, this is what we would use to change the date range for the pivot table. Let's go back to the formulas and click on calculated field. In this case here, I want to calculate something: ACT for actual, V for versus, BUD for budget. What we see here are those fields there. So what I want is, for the formula, take that 0 off. I can either double click on this here, and if I double click, it would put the value field in here, or I could actually type it in, or use this to insert the field. For the actual, I will double click to put that in there, then I do a minus, and for the budget I would actually just highlight it and use insert field to put that in as well. So when I press add, that goes in here, which clearly would appear on here as well. Now that we've got that in, we can also create the achievement calculation as well. So I would overtype that name and call this achievement. And for this we need a simple formula, which is a simple if formula, pardon me, equal to if if is error, that is, if we take this and divide that what we just calculated and divide that by the budget. If that is an error, then put a 0, else put a 1 plus. We're using a 1 plus because it's an achievement, it's not a variance. I would then use actual, divide that by budget, then I'll close off this calculation, add that as well. Again, it's appeared on this, appeared here as well at the very bottom. If I press OK now, those two columns will now appear on the pivot table report. So we can see those two there. For the sum of actual versus budget, I need to rename that. I could easily just overtype on the cell, so I can just go ACT-BUD, and that's exactly the same thing as doing this and going to the value list and giving it a custom name. We don't need to specify a number format because it should pick it up from the previous one, since it's a calculation. For the achievement, we expect to see percentages, so we need to format this slightly. First, I'll just give it my custom name, abbreviated achievement %, and then I right click on it, go into the value field settings, go to number formats, go to percentage, and do 1 point %. Then OK, 1 decimal place, pardon me. If I do OK again, we should now see an achievement of 118. So that is telling me that that over that is actually 118%. So the report, our report now is beginning to look fairly similar to what we saw at the beginning of this video. There are other things we can go ahead to do now, and one of them is to, if I were to, for example, if I wish to see the details of these, we can, bear with me 1 second. So actually I think I would probably stop the video here and continue, because there is a time limit of 15 minutes. I would continue with these in part 2, so please do join me in part 2.